I was 71 years old, standing on my own son's front steps with a cake carrier in both hands, when I heard him call me crazy. The window was open. 4 of his friends were in that room, and they had just watched him throw the thing I had spent 3 weeks planning and 4 hours making out onto the sidewalk below, and for a moment, nobody said anything, and then somebody laughed, and I looked at what was left on the walk. The salted caramel had spread across the concrete, like something spilled carelessly, which is exactly what it was. And I understood that I was not going to knock on that door. I picked up my purse and my keys, and I got in the car. It was his 41st birthday. I had made the cake for every single one. I drove home, and I sat at my kitchen table, and I thought about that number for a while. Then I picked up the phone. Not to call him. I had 3 other calls to make first. "Welcome, friends. I'm Grace." He threw it out the window, a cake she planned for 3 weeks. 41 birthdays, and that's what she got. Stay with us. Subscribe so you're here when Loretta decides what comes next. The cake had been on my mind since the 3rd week of August. That is how I have always worked. Not impulsively, not at the last minute. When I ran Calloway's on Main Street for 22 years, we took custom orders 3 weeks out minimum. And the reason was never just scheduling. It was because a cake done right requires that long to think through properly. You have to decide what you are after before you ever turn on the oven. The flavor is the easy part. The structure, the crumb, the way the components are going to talk to each other, that takes time to work out in your head, and if you skip that step, you end up with something that is technically correct, but has no particular soul to it. My customers knew the difference between a cake that was made and a cake that was thought about. They had been coming back for 22 years. That does not happen by accident. For Dwayne's birthday this year, I had settled on an olive oil almond cake with salted caramel. Not because it was simple, which it is not, but because it was right. He had mentioned once, maybe 18 months ago, offhand the way he mentions most things, that the best dessert he'd ever had was something in that family, at a restaurant in Memphis he'd gone to with a client. He probably didn't remember saying it. I wrote it down in the small notebook I keep on the kitchen counter, the one with the green cover that I've been keeping since 2011, when I understood that my memory was no longer as reliable as it once was. I am methodical about writing things down. That habit has served me in ways I could not have anticipated when I started it. The olive oil has to be good. Not the cooking grade you buy for salad dressing, but something with real flavor, slightly peppery, the kind with a finish that you can taste past the sweetness of the cake. I get it from the specialty grocery on Spring Street, $11 for a small bottle, and I went through 2 of them, developing the recipe, because I was not going to approximate. The almond flour I order from a supplier I have used since the Calloway's days. The grocery store variety is too coarse and throws off the texture in a way that most people would not notice, but that I notice. I made the caramel twice. The first batch seized on me when I got distracted by a phone call from Nadine and pulled the pan a few seconds too late, and I threw it out and started the second batch that same evening without any particular drama about it, because a seized caramel is a seized caramel, and there is no working around it. The second batch was right. I knew it was right by the color and by the way it moved in the pan. After 22 years, you stop needing to second-guess these things. The morning of the birthday, I was up at 5:15. My body has not forgotten what 5 in the morning means after 4 decades of it, and I have stopped trying to sleep past it because the effort costs more than it's worth. I had the layers cooling by 8 and the caramel assembled by 10, And I put the cake together carefully, taking my time, the way you do when there is no deadline and no customer waiting. The palette knife I used has a slight bend in the blade from a dropped sheet pan in 2001 that I keep meaning to have straightened and never do, because by now I work around the bend the way you work around any imperfection in a trusted tool. The caramel went in smoothly. The crumb was what I had been aiming for. Open enough that the olive oil shows in the texture, tight enough to hold without the layers sliding. Every cake was exact. That was my standard at Calloway's, and it remained my standard after I sold the shop in 2020, because standards do not leave with the business. I set the cake in the carrier at noon, and I drove the 2 blocks to the rental house. The drive takes about 4 minutes if you catch the light on Main. I parked, took the carrier from the back seat, walked up the front steps. It was a warm afternoon, late September, the kind of day that smells like dry grass and someone's dryer vent. I was thinking, as I climbed the steps, about whether I had remembered the candles. I had not. They were still in the kitchen drawer at my house. A box of 12, pale gold, the thin kind that looked better on an adult cake than the primary color ones. I had bought them specifically. I stood on the steps for a moment. The window was open. I could hear voices inside. Dwayne's laugh, which carries, and 2 or 3 other voices underneath it. I thought about driving back for the candles. I thought about knocking and explaining, because it was a small thing and easily remedied. I knocked. He came to the door. He looked at the carrier. Something moved across his face that I did not immediately read. I said, "I forgot the candles. They're at the house. I can run back." He said, "And I want to be precise about this, because the words matter." He said, "Mama, are you serious right now? What is wrong with you?" He took the carrier from my hands. I thought for one moment, genuinely, that he was going to carry it inside. He turned and walked to the open window, and he dropped it out. Not through dropped, the way you put something down when you have decided it is no longer relevant. The carrier opened on the way down, and the cake went with it. I heard the caramel tin hit the sidewalk. I heard one of the friends in the room say something under his breath, and then someone laughed, and Dwayne turned back around, and his face had already moved on to the next thing, the way it does when he is with people and performing for the room. He said, "Sorry, Mama, it's been a day. I stood there for a moment. I did not say anything. I picked up my purse and walked back down the steps. I looked at the cake on the sidewalk for a moment. The caramel had spread, and the almond layers had broken apart on the concrete, and the whole thing was open to the sky. A yellow jacket had already found it. I did not pick it up. I got in the car. The drive home is 2 blocks. I did not register it. The house on Garfield Street has been mine since 1995. I bought it as a single mother when Dwayne was 12 years old, and the mortgage payment was close to everything I had coming in at the time, which was not a comfortable position to be in, but was the only position available to me. I had been renting since the divorce in 1989, and I was tired of paying money towards something that would never belong to me. The house was a Craftsman, gray-green, a front porch that faced east. 3 bedrooms. It needed work. I did the work over the years, room by room, as the bakery income allowed, and I paid the mortgage off in 2017 on a Tuesday morning at the bank on Main Street, which has since become a nail salon. I signed the last documents, and the loan officer, not Gerald Pittman, who had processed my original mortgage and retired years before, but a younger woman who did not know the history, handed me a copy, and that was that. 22 years of payments, and then it was simply mine. the way a thing becomes yours when you have finally finished earning it. I remember standing in the driveway the day the final check cleared, just standing there in the October cold, looking at the house from the outside. The crepe myrtle I had planted along the south fence the second year was tall enough by then to be genuinely impressive in fall color. The porch steps needed repainting, which they have needed repainting every 3 years since I bought the place, and which I have attended to every 3 years without exception. The neighborhood had changed considerably since 1995. Some houses improved, some declined, a few empty lots filled in with new construction that I found architecturally questionable, but did not say so aloud because other people's houses are their business. My house was mine. I had bought it and maintained it and paid for it over 2 decades, and it was mine. I stood in the driveway for about 10 minutes. Then I went inside and made dinner. The kitchen is the room that matters most to me and always has been. I renovated it twice after 1995, and the second renovation in 2016 was the one I had been planning since roughly 2013. New counters in a pale soapstone, a Blue Star 6-burner range in a dark slate color that I chose after looking at every comparable model on the market and deciding that if I was going to spend the money, I was going to spend it on something that would last, a deep farmhouse sink that I had wanted since I first saw one in a kitchen supply catalog in 1998 and had waited 18 years to afford correctly. My neighbor, Mrs. Arsenault, asked me why I needed a 6-burner range at home, and I told her, because someday I will need 6 burners, and when that day comes, I will not have to wish I had them. She shook her head in the way she often does at me, which is a kind of affectionate skepticism I have come to find comforting. When I got home from the sidewalk, I stood in that kitchen for a moment without doing anything particular. Not crying. I want to say that clearly and mean it. I am not a person who cries easily, not because I have suppressed the impulse, but because it genuinely requires something significant to reach me that way, and the birthday had reached me in a different direction entirely. What it had done was make things quiet. People who know me well know that my quiet is a different register from my ordinary manner. Nadine has said more than once over the years that she can tell when I am serious because I stop filling the space with words. I had stopped filling the space. I put the kettle on because I needed something to do with my hands. I sat at the kitchen table. The green notebook was on the counter where it always is, next to the stand mixer and the row of spice tins. I did not reach for it yet. I sat and looked at the east window, which in the afternoon gets a slant of light that falls across the floor, and I thought about the number 41. 41 years, not as a metaphor, not as a general sense of a long time, as a specific, countable number. I had been making that man a birthday cake since he was a year old, and could not have told anyone what a birthday was. Every year, without exception. There had been years when the cake was simpler than others, years when the bakery was demanding, and I was exhausted, and I made him something good but quick, and years when the cake was the most elaborate thing I made all month, because I had the time and the occasion seemed to call for it. But every year, one had been made. By me. For him. With attention and intention. That is not a small thing, regardless of how it looks to someone from the outside. It is 41 acts of deliberate care, and I had been in the habit of not counting them, because counting them felt, for a long time, like the wrong kind of bookkeeping for a mother to do about her own child. The tea had been in the cup long enough that it was past its best temperature. I got up and poured it out and made a fresh cup. I did this without thinking much about it. It is the kind of small domestic correction I make automatically, the way a baker automatically levels a measuring cup or checks the oven temperature before trusting the dial. You develop these corrections until they are reflexive. You develop them because the alternative is accepting something that is less than right when right is available. I stood at the counter with the fresh cup, and I looked at the green notebook. I had been looking at it on and off for 2 years. Today, I was going to pick it up. Sitting at that table, with the afternoon light moving across the floor and the tea cooling again because I forgot to drink it, I understood something I had been circling for a long time. Counting was not the wrong thing. Not counting had been the thing that allowed 41 years to pass without a single one of them being accounted for. The notebook had been on the counter the whole time. I had simply been choosing not to add it up. I should tell you something about Dwayne before I tell you more about what happened after, because I think it matters that you understand who he is, not who he was in that moment at the window. That moment is clear enough, and I don't need to explain it. I mean who he is as a person, over the whole range of him, because he is not a simple man, and I did not raise a simple man, and it would not be honest to flatten him into someone easier to feel about. He has always had a good laugh. Warm, carrying, the kind that makes people want to turn toward the room. He got it from his father, who I have not spoken to since 1990, and whose departure from our lives I do not regret, but the laugh came down clean. Dwayne could light a room from the time he was 5, and he knew it without being cynical about it, which is actually rare. Some people learn early that charm is a currency, and they spend it strategically. Dwayne was never like that. He was just easy, genuinely, and without calculation, and other people responded to that, and he was always a little surprised that they did. I loved watching that surprise in him. I still do, when it comes up. He was a decent student, not an exceptional one. His mind was better with people than with texts, and he gravitated naturally toward anything that required reading a room. Sales was the obvious fit. When he found it, in his late 20s, he was good at it in the way that people are good at things that suit their fundamental nature. He did well when he applied himself. The trouble was not his ability, but his consistency, which varied according to factors I never fully understood. Motivation, the specific company, the product he was selling, whether the circumstances of his personal life were settled enough to let him focus. He could be brilliant at it, and he could disappear from it, and the distance between those two states had grown wider in recent years. He called me Mama his whole life. Not Mom, Mama. I used to love that. I would be lying if I said I still heard it the same way, but I do not want to say I resent it, because that is not what it is. It is more that the word lands differently when the context around it has shifted, the way a note in a song can sound different depending on the chord underneath it. There was a version of Dwayne I could always call up clearly in my memory, even now, even after the window. It was the version from a Tuesday evening in 2007, when he was 24 and had driven from Corinth without calling first, and knocked on my door at 7 at night, smelling of a long drive and fast food. I let him in, and he sat at the kitchen table, and I made him a plate of whatever I had. This would have been red beans and rice. It was a Tuesday. And he sat there for 2 hours just talking, not about anything specific, about his job, about a woman he was seeing who he wasn't sure about a friend who was going through something difficult. He didn't need anything from me that night, except to be in the kitchen on Garfield while his mother fed him red beans and rice. That was the whole visit. He drove back to Corinth around 9. I thought about that evening a lot. in the weeks after the birthday. It was a real memory of him. It was him at his most genuine. It did not cancel the window, but it complicated the picture in ways I think are important to be honest about. The 4 friends at the window. I had met 2 of them before. Marcus, who sells insurance somewhere off Highway 45, a large, soft-spoken man who has been in Dwayne's orbit since they were both in their late 20s. And Joey, who I associate with the years when Dwayne was 22 and making decisions I had opinions about and did not voice as often as I should have. The other 2 I did not know. What I knew was that all 4 of them had watched, and some of them had laughed, and not one of them had looked uncomfortable enough to say anything. They had followed Dwayne's lead because they always did, because that is what happens when a man has been the funniest and easiest person in every room he has ever stood in. The room takes its cues from him. He made it light. They followed. Flowers arrived the next morning. Pink roses delivered with a card that said, "Mama, sorry about yesterday, love Dwayne." I put them in water. They were nice. They were the right gesture in the way that a gesture can be right, and also completely insufficient. And I stood at the sink, looking at them for a moment before I went on with my morning. I noticed that he had not called. I had not expected him to. I was not going to pretend that I had. He had been sending pink roses since his 20s, because I mentioned once, at some point long past, that I liked them. He had written it down somewhere in his memory and retrieved it every time an apology was required. I do not say that to be uncharitable. I say it because the pattern tells you something. He had always known how to make the gesture that closed the immediate distance without requiring him to cross it on foot. That is a skill. It served him well for a long time because I let it. I told myself it was enough. It was easier to tell myself that than to say, "This is not enough, and here is what would be enough instead." That conversation was a harder one. I had been deferring it for years. The flowers were in good water, and they would last another week. I had my coffee, and I went about my morning, and I did not call him. There was nothing to say yet that was ready to be said. Calloway's on Main Street opened in March of 1998. I was 38 years old, and I had been working in other people's kitchens since I was 19, and the opening felt less like a beginning than like a thing that had been building pressure for a long time and had finally found a door. I had saved for 4 years, a specific account, a specific number I was working toward, the way I work toward everything, in writing, in columns, with a target and a timeline. Nadine came in as a co-owner in that first year and bought out her share in 2009 when she wanted to open her own place. Those 11 years we ran it together were the best working years of my life. We knew how the other thought. We very rarely agreed on everything, and we never needed to. What I built at Calloway's over 22 years was a reputation for exactness, not fussiness. Those are different things. Fussiness is about preference and performance. Exactness is about standards and follow-through. I was exact because I believed that the people who came to me for their wedding cakes and their anniversary cakes and their grandmother's 80th birthday deserved something that was built with the same care they had put into deciding to celebrate in the first place. A celebration is a serious thing. It marks time. It says, this moment mattered enough to commemorate. I took that seriously on their behalf every time for 22 years without exception. The shop was on the corner of Main and Jefferson, a narrow storefront with 2 display cases and a kitchen in the back that was small enough to require organization as a survival skill. I kept it clean with the particular discipline of a person who has worked in cramped professional kitchens and understands that disorder in a small space is not just inefficient, it is dangerous. Every tool had a place. Every batch was labeled. The order board on the back wall showed everything going out that week in columns, with the customer name and the delivery or pickup time in the same handwriting I used for everything. My handwriting is unremarkable but consistent. I was told once by a customer who was a retired schoolteacher that it reminded her of a recipe card from the 1950s. I took this as a compliment. I taught 3 apprentices in that time. 2 of them went on to open their own operations, which I considered the best possible outcome. The third, a young woman named Bettina Carr, who came to me in 2015 right out of culinary school, stayed until the sale, and then moved to Nashville, where she now runs the pastry program at a hotel I looked up once and found very respectable. All 3 would tell you, if you asked, that I never let a thing leave that kitchen that wasn't right. That is a fact and not a boast. It is simply the standard I set and held to. I had one rule that I stated to every new apprentice on their first day. If you think something is close enough, it isn't. Close enough is not a standard. Close enough is a decision to stop paying attention. And once you are in the habit of stopping attention, you will stop it in the wrong place. The whole architecture of what Calloway's became, the reputation, the returning customers, the fact that we never had a wedding cake complaint in 22 years, rested on that one rule, applied every morning, before anyone else was awake. I sold the shop in 2020 to Patricia Fossey from Oxford. She had found us through a mutual contact, driven down one morning without calling ahead, introduced herself in the shop, and asked if she could look at the kitchen. I liked her immediately. She asked good questions. Not about revenue first, but about the recipes and the staff and whether the current team would stay. She made an offer that surprised my broker. I said yes. She kept the name and the recipes and the core staff, and the last time I drove past the corner of Main and Jefferson, the display cases were full, and there was a line out the door on a Saturday morning. That pleased me. What I bring this up to say is that a woman who has spent 22 years building something on exactness and accountability, on the radical principle that things should be what they say they are, does not stop noticing when things are not what they say they are. She just sometimes chooses for years not to act on what she notices. That was the version of me that had been living on Garfield Street since 2022. The version who kept the green notebook and wrote in it faithfully and walked past it every morning on her way to the coffee maker and kept choosing not to do anything about it. I am not proud of that, but I understand it. I had been choosing comfort over clarity because clarity had consequences, and I was not ready for the consequences. The birthday put me in front of them whether I was ready or not. And when I sat down with the notebook and finally added the columns, I found that the numbers had been waiting there for years, perfectly patient, precisely correct, exactly as I had written them. The rental property at 1412 Garfield, 2 doors down from mine, blue shutters, pale yellow I repainted in 2020, I had purchased in 2019 with money from the Calloway sale that was earmarked specifically for it. The sale had closed better than I had projected. Patricia Fossey, the buyer, had come in at an offer that surprised both me and my broker, and she wanted the name and the recipes and most of the staff and the equipment. And once I understood that she intended to keep the place genuinely intact, I said yes. I am not sentimental about commerce. A fair offer is a fair offer, and she made one. I bought the rental because I am the kind of person who believes in owning the thing and not just the idea of the thing. The house had been sitting empty for several months, a previous tenant having moved in with family, and the price was right and the structure was sound. Carl Hibbert, the same Carl Hibbert I would call, 2 years later, about the notice, had handled the closing. He told me at the time to get a solid lease template in place before I put anyone in it. I said I would. I did not immediately because I did not have a tenant yet, and by the time I had a tenant, the circumstances had made a formal lease feel like the wrong tone for the relationship. Dwayne had called in February of 2022 to tell me about the situation at the sales company. A restructuring, territory boundaries redrawn, his region folded into a larger one, his position technically eliminated, though he was being offered a transfer to a smaller territory at a reduced rate. He was not going to take the reduced rate because he was not going to let them undervalue him. He was looking at options. He would be between things for a couple of months. Did I know anyone who could use a good salesman with 7 years of audio equipment experience? He said this last part with the warmth he always brings to himself, gently self-promotional, without being obnoxious about it. I said, "The rental house is empty. It needs some work, but it's livable. You can stay there while you sort it out." He said, "Mama, I don't need charity." I said, "It's not charity. It's $950 a month and a functioning kitchen." He said, "Deal." The deal was not a lease. The deal was a conversation and a handshake and an understanding between a mother and her grown son, and I knew when I made it that it was not enough structure for a real arrangement, and I made it anyway because I wanted to help him and because I told myself that making it formal would signal distrust, and I did not want to signal distrust. That is a thing I am willing to own. I made a choice, and the choice had predictable consequences that I predicted and then chose not to prepare for. The first month. He said he would get me the rent as soon as his severance cleared. Reasonable. The second month. The new position was taking longer to materialize than expected, but he had a good lead. Also reasonable in isolation. The third month I said nothing because the pattern was already visible and something in me was not ready to see it. By the end of the first year, I had 12 entries in the green notebook under the heading 1412 Garfield, each one dated, each one with a brief note, each one with a 0 in the amount column. Not because I had forgotten to fill it in, because there was nothing to fill in. Nadine had said, sometime in early 2023 when we were on the porch with coffee, and I had mentioned the arrangement obliquely, her coffee mug in her hand and her eyes on the street. "Loretta, you need a lease." She said it the way she says things she has thought about in advance, not confrontationally, just with the quiet certainty of someone who has been paying attention. I said I'd handle it. She nodded and did not argue, and we moved on. She is not the kind of friend who argues. She is the kind of friend who says the thing once, clearly, and then waits. I have been the beneficiary of that kind of friendship for 27 years. 24 months at $950 is $22,800. I had calculated that number more than once. I had written it at the bottom of the 1412 Garfield page in the green notebook in pencil, maybe 14 months in, and then written it again in pen when I was more certain I was not going to erase it. It was not a fortune. It was a real number. Dated. Documented in my own hand, column by column, month by month, in a notebook that had been sitting on my kitchen counter in plain sight since 2011. The market rate on Garfield had gone up in that time. Comparable three-bedrooms were running $1,100 by early 2024, and I had not adjusted my number. I had quoted $950, and I do not change numbers partway through a thing. I had simply written the zeros and waited, telling myself I was being patient, which is not the same thing as being clear about what you are doing and why. 41 cakes and $22,800 in uncollected rent. Every cent in that green notebook. Loretta kept the records because that's who she is. Tell me honestly, what would you have done in Loretta's place by year 2? Before I tell you about the 3 phone calls, I want to go back to the birthday cakes. Not all 41. I don't have the time and neither do you, and besides, the point is not the volume. It's the accumulation. What I want to tell you about are a handful of specific years because they show you something about what I understood a birthday cake to mean and what I thought it communicated to a person when you made one for them. His first birthday. A single-layer yellow cake with whipped cream, made in the apartment kitchen on Lafayette Street when I was 30 years old, and Dwayne's father had been gone for less than a year. I did not yet own a KitchenAid. I was still working at Price's, and I made the frosting by hand in a glass bowl with a wire whisk, which took longer than it should have and left my arms sore the next morning. He could not yet manage a fork. He put his face directly into the cake, which is the appropriate response to a first birthday cake, and I have a photograph of him afterward that I have kept in my wallet for 40 years, and that is now so soft at the folds that I am afraid to unfold it all the way. His 5th birthday, Sesame Street, Elmo's face in buttercream, an ungodly amount of orange food coloring. I was working double shifts at Price's because I was saving for Calloway's, and also for a new winter coat, and the savings were slow. I came home at 2 in the afternoon with flour in my hair and made that cake in 3 hours. He looked at it like it was alive. He laughed that laugh at nothing in particular, just the joy of the thing existing. And some days I think that 5-year-old version of him is the truest version. The one before he learned that his ease was a resource other people would manage for him if he let them. His 16th, adobos tort, 7 layers, which I had never made before. He had seen one in a food magazine at the school library the previous year and said it was the most interesting-looking cake he'd ever seen. I wrote it down. I taught myself from a recipe in a Hungarian cookbook I found at the Tupelo library, and from a description in a professional pastry text I ordered from a bakery supply company. I practiced twice before I made the real one. The caramel top layer did not behave on the first attempt. I stayed up until midnight getting the second attempt right. When he saw it on his birthday, he said quietly, "Mama, that's the one from the magazine." "Yes," I said. "It is." He did not make a big thing of it. Neither did I. That was enough. His 29th. He was in a bad stretch, working a job he hated in Corinth, 70 miles away, driving back when he could manage it. I had asked what he wanted, and he said something simple, "Whatever's easy." I made the coconut layer cake with fresh lime curd anyway, because it was not simple and not easy, and it was what I thought he needed, which is not always the same as what someone asks for. He cried when he saw it. Just briefly. The startled way that men cry when something surprises a feeling out of them. He didn't say anything about it, and neither did I. We ate cake and drank coffee, and he drove back to Corinth. His 31st. I drove to Oxford and back, 80 miles round trip, to deliver it, because he had said he couldn't make it home that week, and I saw no reason to let the birthday go unmarked on account of geography. I did not think of the drive as a sacrifice. I thought of it as getting the cake where it needed to go. When I got home that evening, I was tired, both feet aching the way they do, and I sat in the kitchen with a cup of tea and thought nothing in particular about the day. I did not add it to a ledger. I did not expect anything in return. I just went to bed. His 41st. I had been planning the olive oil almond cake for 3 weeks. The caramel I made twice. The layers were perfect. I drove 2 blocks. I forgot the candles. He called me crazy and he threw it out a window. Every cake was exact. That is what I mean when I say it. 41 years and each one was exactly right. And on the one occasion, the single occasion, when I arrived at a door without one small box of candles in my hand, I was told, in front of 4 people, that something was wrong with me. I sat at the kitchen table that evening, and I let myself look at the whole 41 years at once, the way you hold a piece of fabric up to the light to check the weave. I looked at the 80 miles, and the Dobos tort, and the whipped cream in the glass bowl, and the birthday in Corinth, and every year between the first and the last. And what I saw was not a record of my goodness. It was a record of my choices. I had chosen 41 times to show up for that man exactly as I said I would. Not because I expected something in return, because I had a standard and I held to it. The standard was mine. It had always been mine. He had simply benefited from it without ever being asked to account for it. I was not angry when I understood this. I was just clear in a way I had not been before. There are other numbers besides the rent and the birthday cakes. I want to tell you about them not because they are large numbers. Most of them are not. But because I want you to understand the texture of what accumulates when a person is in the habit of absorbing small costs without recording them as costs. They are easy to miss individually. Together, they have a specific weight. March of 2023. Dwayne called to tell me his transmission had gone. Not to ask for help. He called to tell me about it, the way he recounts misfortunes, with a kind of resigned humor, as though life's inconveniences are a comedy he is narrating, rather than a set of problems requiring solutions. I said, "How much will it be?" He said, "Birch Automotive quoted $940." I said, "I'll call Roy over there." He said, "Mama, you don't have to." I said, "I know I don't have to." I transferred $940 to his account the following morning, and I wrote it in the green notebook. He said he'd pay it back. I wrote that too, in a separate column, with a question mark. October of 2023. His utility bill had fallen behind and Energy had sent a disconnect notice. He sent me a photograph of the notice without commentary. I paid it online, $218.42. And I wrote the date and the amount and the notation, Entergy, 1412 Garfield. He sent back a thumbs up. 3 grocery trips across 2022 and 2023. The amounts were $67, $67 again, and $84.50. I know these numbers because they are in the notebook, not because I was keeping score. I was keeping records, which is different. When I was running Calloway's, I kept records of everything, the flour orders and the egg deliveries and the overtime hours and the customer deposits. Records are not grievances. They are just the factual shape of what happened. There was also the matter of the refrigerator. In the summer of 2022, shortly after Dwayne moved in, the refrigerator in the rental house stopped cooling properly. He mentioned this over the phone, and I said I'd look into getting it repaired. I looked into it and discovered that the compressor was failing, and a repair would run nearly as much as a replacement. I had a second refrigerator in my own house, a smaller one in the back room that I had used during the years I was doing a high volume of custom orders to keep finished elements chilled until they were ready to assemble. I was not currently using it. I moved it to the rental house. I did not charge him for it. I did not write it in the notebook because it was a thing I owned and gave, not money. But I remember it. I add all of this up not out of bitterness. I want to be precise about that, because bitterness would simplify the picture in ways that would not be true. I add it up because I am a woman who spent her adult life understanding that the way things are is not always the same as the way they are recorded to be, and that the recording matters. My father used to say that if it isn't written down, it didn't happen, which is not exactly true, but contains a kind of truth about how human beings manage to avoid seeing things that are standing directly in front of them. I had been not writing certain things for years. The notebook held what I had written. The space around it held what I had not. The small amounts, the grocery trips, and the utility bill and the car repair came to just over $1,200 across 2 years. Not much individually. When you set them next to $22,800, it looks small. But small is not the same as nothing, and I want to be precise. $1,200 is what my Social Security covers in just over a month. That is not an abstraction. That is a number that has a particular meaning to a 71-year-old woman on a fixed income who has built everything she owns from scratch and knows exactly what a dollar costs to accumulate. I did not need the money back. What I needed was to stop pretending it wasn't there. When I finally sat down with the green notebook and opened to the 1412 Garfield page and added the columns, all of them, every entry in order, I did not feel anger. What I felt was something closer to recognition. The same feeling I used to get when a batch of dough finally came together after the third adjustment, when the texture in your hands told you, this is it. This is what it was supposed to be. This is the right thing. The number was what it was, and it had been that number the whole time, and I had simply not been willing to look at it directly until now. The flowers from the morning after the birthday were still on the sideboard. Pink roses, doing well. I had changed the water. Nice flowers. I kept looking at them across the kitchen and thinking about the phone call that had not come with them. He had found the gesture he knew how to make, and he had made it. The harder gesture, driving over, knocking on the door, sitting across a table and saying the thing directly, that one had not come. I did not expect it to. In 41 years, he had never had reason to learn to make that harder gesture, because I had always accepted the easier one. That is a thing I take responsibility for. It does not change what he did, but it is true, and I think truth requires saying both parts. Nadine had the attorney's number ready when I called her that evening. She had it because she had been waiting 3 years for me to be ready to need it. That is what a good friend does. She prepares quietly, and she waits. Those were the 2 things I needed: the number she had been keeping, and the notebook I had been keeping. Both had been there all along. I want to tell you about Carl Hibbert, because he deserves more than a mention. Carl has been handling my real estate matters since 2019. He is 64 years old, gray-haired, a man of careful speech who operates from an office on Court Street that looks exactly the way a property attorney's office in a Mississippi County seat should look. Bookshelves, good natural light, a desk that has been in use long enough to have stories. His manner is the kind of unhurried that comes not from slowness, but from a thorough lack of interest in drama. He has seen every version of a family property dispute that exists, and he has long since stopped being surprised by any of them. When I first mentioned the rental arrangement to him in 2021, he told me to put a lease in place. He explained this the same way he explains everything, not with alarm, just with the plain logic of a man who has seen what happens when people don't. I told him I'd handle it. He noted this in his file and said, "Whenever you're ready." He told me again in 2022. He told me again in 2023 with slightly more emphasis, because by then the arrangement had been running informally for well over a year, and he had done the math on what that meant. I told him I'd handle it. He noted it. What he did not do in any of those conversations was press me. He gave me his professional opinion, I received it, and he let me make my own choices about it. I had come to him initially through Nadine, who had used him for a property matter in 2018 and said he was someone who said exactly what he meant and never charged you for more than he did. That turned out to be an accurate description. He is not a flashy man. He does not have the particular energy of lawyers who need you to need them. He just does the work correctly and gives you the information you need to make your own decisions. I appreciate that in a professional. I appreciate it considerably in anyone. When I called him on the Thursday morning after the birthday, at 9 o'clock, he said, "Good morning, Loretta. Give me a moment to pull up the file." I heard him typing. I explained what I needed. He said, "I have a notice to vacate drafted." The informal tenancy, month to month, requires 30 days written notice under Mississippi law. He went through the details the way he goes through everything, methodically, without editorializing. I asked 2 questions about the documented unpaid rent: whether the notebook constituted an adequate record and whether it had any legal standing as a claim. He said, "Bring the notebook in and let me see it." He did not say, "I told you so." I have found over the years that the best professionals rarely do. Roy Hutchins on Church Street was the 3rd call. Roy is my accountant, has been since 1999, and he has the unhurried certainty of a man who understands that numbers do not have moods. I brought the green notebook to his office on the following Tuesday. He went through it column by column, the way accountants go through things, silently, checking, occasionally making a small notation in pencil. When he was done, he said, "This is clean and accurate." He prepared a summary document that itemized the uncollected rent by month and the supplementary amounts in a separate column. The document had a total at the bottom. It was a real number, real in the legal sense, which is what I needed to know. I asked him, "What does it mean if I don't pursue it?" He said, "It means you have a record of it." I said, "I know." He said, "Then you know what you have." I did know what I had. I had always known what I had. The notebook had been on my counter for 3 years, sitting there every morning while I made coffee. And I had written in it because writing things down is the only way I know how to think clearly. And I had not used it because I had not been ready to use it. And now I was ready. The notice went out 2 weeks after the birthday. Carl filed it on a Wednesday. I had used those 2 weeks the way I use most difficult periods, by going about my ordinary life and waiting for myself to change my mind. I deadheaded the crepe myrtle on the south side of the house, which I had been meaning to do since August. I made a small pound cake for Mrs. Arsenault's birthday and a batch of brown butter tea cakes for my own consumption, because I wanted something warm and simple, and those are the easiest things I know how to make. I slept well. I ate at regular times. I sat on the front porch in the mornings with my coffee, and I looked at the street and at the blue shutters 2 doors down, and I thought, I am still the woman who owned a bakery for 22 years. I am still the woman who showed up at 5 in the morning and got things right. I am applying those same standards now. That is all this is. On the morning of the 12th day, I woke up and I still had not changed my mind, and so I called Carl and told him to proceed. She wasn't crying at that table. She was counting. 3 calls, 1 notebook, 22 years of knowing exactly what things cost. Honestly, what would you have done in Loretta's position? I should tell you something about patience, because I think I have given the impression that mine is a virtue, and I want to be more precise than that. Patience in a bakery is not the same thing as patience in a relationship. In a bakery, patience is technical. You wait because the yeast needs time, because the butter needs to come to temperature, because the caramel will tell you when it is ready and not a moment before. That patience is in service of a result you are trying to achieve, and the waiting is purposeful. You are doing something while you wait, which is paying attention. The thing that tests your patience in a bakery is not doubt. You know what you are working toward. The only question is whether the process has had sufficient time. The patience I exercised toward Dwayne for the better part of 2 years was a different animal entirely. It was not purposeful waiting. It was the patience of a woman who had decided without quite deciding that she was not going to look at a thing that was plainly in front of her, because looking at it would require her to do something she was not yet ready to do. That is not patience. That is avoidance dressed in patient clothing. I know the difference now. I am not sure I fully knew it then. The 2 weeks between my decision and the filing of the notice were not difficult. That surprised me. I had expected some internal argument, some version of myself that would wake up at 3 in the morning and begin building the case for why I should let it go, try one more time, make one more phone call. That version did not show up. What showed up instead was a kind of ordinariness. The days were quiet and normal, and I went about them the way I go about most days, and the decision sat in the background like a thing I had already finished. I had been waiting, I realized, for the moment when the weight of the thing equaled the cost of doing something about it. The birthday had put them in balance. I had been waiting for that balance for years without knowing I was waiting. Dwayne did not call in those 2 weeks. He had sent the flowers, and that was his understanding of how these things resolved. He made the gesture. Some period of time passed. The matter was over. I had taught him to understand it that way by accepting that resolution every time before. I watched the flowers on the sideboard and thought about the training of expectations. How carefully and unconsciously you can teach a person what the consequences of their behavior will be, and how thoroughly that teaching sticks, and how it sticks in both directions. He had learned from me that the consequences of taking me for granted were flowers and a brief silence, and then everything returning to the way it was. I had learned from him, though it took 41 years, that the arrangement would continue exactly as long as I allowed it to. On the 11th day, I threw out the flowers. They had gone past their best point. The petals dropping, the water turned. I tipped them into the compost and washed the vase and set it back on the sideboard, and the next morning I called Carl. There is a moment in bread baking when the dough has been proofed correctly and the oven is at temperature, when you put the loaf in and close the door, and that is all you can do. The process is no longer yours to manage. It belongs to time and heat. Bakers who are new to it want to open the door early, to check, to adjust, to intervene. You learn not to. You learn that the hardest part of good bread is leaving it alone long enough to become what it was always going to be. I closed the door. I went about my ordinary days. I let the process finish. The notice was standard. The language was not cold. It was simply accurate, in the way that legal documents are accurate when they are prepared correctly. 60 days notice, the date by which the property was to be vacated, the terms of the informal tenancy. Carl had it ready in less than an hour. He had been keeping the file current, he told me, just in case. I thought about the number of times he had told me to get the lease in place. I thought about the version of me who had nodded and said she'd handle it. That version had finally handled it, which is perhaps not exactly what she'd meant when she said it. But here we are. The notice was received on a Friday. I know this because I was on my porch at the time, and I watched the mail carrier on our block come through at 11, and the carrier was at Dwayne's door at 11:12. He was home that day. His car was in the driveway. I had not planned to watch. I was simply sitting on my porch with my coffee the way I sit every morning, and watching was the natural consequence of sitting in that direction. He called at 12:17. I looked at the phone. I set it on the porch railing. I watched the street. He called again at 12:22, then 12:31, which was a shorter call. He probably got voicemail and hung up to collect himself. Then 1:05, 1:40, 2:12. By 4 o'clock, it was 7 calls. I logged the date and time of each one in the green notebook in the way I had always logged entries. Date, time, brief notation. Not with satisfaction, not with grief. With the same attention I had applied to everything else. The text came between the 6th and 7th call. Mama, call me. 3 words. I read it and set the phone down. The 7th call lasted 43 seconds by the call log. That means he talked to the voicemail for more than half a minute, which means there was something he needed to say badly enough that he set it to a recording. I did not listen to it that day. I finished my coffee, and I went inside, and I started thinking about dinner. By the end of the following week, 14 calls. Not evenly spaced. They clustered at specific hours that told me something about when he was sitting still enough to feel the weight of it. Midday calls during the slack in a sales day. 2 evening calls past 9, when the day was done, and whatever he had been using to fill it was no longer sufficient. A call on Thursday at 10:15 that I suspected came after Amber had said something to him, or had been silent in a way that said something. The calls went from short to long across the 2 weeks. The early ones under 2 minutes, the later ones pushing 3 and 4, which is a man moving through confusion and irritation, and towards something that felt, at a distance, like actual reckoning. I logged the date and time of everyone. Date, time, duration from the call log, brief notation about the tone where I could infer it from the callback behavior. The same column I had used for the rent entries, the car repair, the utility bill. There was a completeness to the record that I found, if not comforting, at least correct. This was what had happened. It was in writing now. That was enough. I listened to all the voicemails on a Sunday morning, sitting at the kitchen table with my coffee, the way I approach anything I need to give proper attention to. Not as punishment to myself, and not as evidence gathering, just as the responsible thing to do when 14 people have called, even when the 14 calls are all from the same person. I listened to them in order. The first 2 were confusion. Are you serious? Call me back. The 5th had irritation in it. He was starting to understand this was not a clerical error. The 7th was defensive in the flat, preemptive way of a man who is beginning to feel something real. The ninth started with Mama in a different register than usual, less easy, more careful, like the word cost him something to say. He said he knew about the rent. He said he understood that he had been taking advantage of a good situation, and that was on him. He said he wanted to talk. The 11th was the one I listened to twice. He said, "Mama, I know what I did at the birthday was wrong. I know I've been wrong about a lot of things for a while now. I'm not trying to negotiate anything. I just want you to know that I know." I listened to it the second time, and then I put the phone face down on the table and I sat with my coffee for a moment. I did not call back. I wrote the time and a brief notation in the notebook. Then I turned the page. The 14th call came on a Tuesday evening at 8:47. I watched the phone light up on the kitchen table, watched his name on the screen, watched it ring 4 times and go to voicemail. I set the phone back down and went back to the book I had been reading. A history of the cotton trade in the Delta that I had found at the library sale and had been meaning to start for 2 months. I read 3 pages. Then I set it down and sat for a while in the ordinary quiet of my kitchen, the blue star ticking as it cooled. The street outside settled into its evening sounds. There is a question I have been asked since, by people who have heard parts of this story. Wasn't it cruel not answering once across those 2 weeks? I have thought about it carefully, the way I think about things I want to be honest about. What I keep coming back to is this. No. Cruelty requires intent to cause pain. I had no interest in causing him pain. What I had was nothing left to say that the notice had not already said more precisely than I could have managed in a voice conversation. Any call I took would have been conducted inside the old dynamic. His warmth, my habit of responding to it, the long-established pattern of things ending on terms that mostly suited him. The silence was not punishment. It was the removal of the familiar instrument so that what remained was only the real thing. A legal document, a documented record, and the space for him to sit with the actual weight of it for the first time. I thought that was more honest than any conversation I could have offered. I still think so. Dwayne was out of the rental house by the middle of October. He had found an apartment on Highway 72, 2 bedrooms, close to the sales office where he was working at the time, a ground floor unit with a small porch. I know these details because he told me eventually, not because I asked. He moved over a weekend with the help of Marcus and Joey and a rented truck. He left the rental house in good condition. I mean that without irony. The walls were clean, the floors were swept. He had even touched up the paint around the kitchen window where there had been some scuffing, and this last detail, the touched-up paint around the window, I noticed and thought about for a moment, and then set aside. He was not a careless person with things. He had always been careless in the other direction. The refrigerator I had lent him was back in the corner of the kitchen where it had always been meant to be. The dishes he had used from the set I'd put in there were stacked on the counter, washed and dry. He had left a note on the kitchen table. Paper, folded in half, my name on the front in his handwriting, which I recognized the way I would recognize anything that has been in my daily life since it first existed. The note said, "I'll do better." That was all. I folded it back along its crease and I put it in the drawer with the green notebook. I walked through the rental house room by room after he left, the way I walked through a kitchen at the end of a service, checking. The bathroom floor clean, the baseboards free of dust. The window in the back bedroom that had always stuck, still stuck. I noted that in the house file I keep in my desk, with a notation to call the contractor in the spring. The house was still mine. It had always been mine. The arrangement had changed, the house had not. I had the house listed properly by the following week. Priya Shankar and her husband came to see it on a Saturday morning, and they were quiet and methodical, and asked about the water heater and the insulation and the condition of the roof, which told me they were planning to stay and not just find somewhere to be for a year. I rented to them at $9.50, which was now somewhat below market, and they have paid on the first of every month since. In March, Priya left a potted kalanchoe on my porch with a note in her careful handwriting. Something to brighten your morning. It is on my kitchen windowsill. It is still blooming, orange-red, because I do not overwater it. I know how to tend things. It is worth saying something about Amber before I move on, because she deserves it. She sent me a text in November, 6 weeks after the birthday. Not about the eviction, and not about Dwayne. Just, I think about that day sometimes. I'm sorry. She had been with him for 14 months by then. She had watched him from close enough range to see the small things he does not know he does, and she had done her own accounting of it. And what she chose to do with her accounting was send that text. I wrote back one word. Thanks. I meant it completely. I hope she continues doing her own accounting. I think she will. She struck me from the beginning as a woman who pays attention to the right things. Dwayne and I spoke in December. He called on a Saturday and asked if he could come by, and I said yes. He came at 2 p.m, which is when I have the coffee cake out, and we sat at the kitchen table and were careful with each other in the way of two people who are relearning the dimensions of a room. He did not bring up the cake or the window or the notice. I did not bring them up. We talked about his apartment, about the sales job, about a few things that were easy to talk about. Near the end of the visit, he said, "Mama, I owe you an apology." I said, "Yes, you do." He said it. It was short, and it was real, and it was enough. Not because it settled everything, but because it was the first time in a long while he had made the harder gesture instead of the easier one. I poured more coffee and we moved on. That is where things stand. Careful, present, and beginning again from closer to the truth than we have been in years. 14 calls and she didn't pick up once. Logged every single one like inventory. Some people call that cold. I call it a woman who finally stopped absorbing consequences that weren't hers to absorb. What do you think? I want to go back to something I said earlier about the difference between patience and avoidance, because I think I was too quick to be harsh on myself about it, and I want to be more accurate. There were real reasons why I let the arrangement with Dwayne continue the way it did, and those reasons were not all weakness. Some of them were love, straightforwardly. He was my son, and I had loved him since before he was born, and that love did not require that he be consistent or reliable or even particularly grateful. Love rarely does require those things. That is part of what makes it useful, and part of what makes it difficult to manage. When I looked at the 0 in the rent column and chose not to say anything, it was not simply because I was afraid of conflict, though I was afraid of conflict. It was also because I thought, he is figuring himself out. He has had harder years recently. I can absorb this for now. That is not entirely weakness. That is a mother's reasonable judgment about what her child needs. What it was not was honest. And the dishonesty, not the patience, not the love, is what I hold responsible for. Where things ended up. I was not honest with him about what the arrangement meant to me. I told myself I was being generous when I was actually being evasive, which is a thing generous people often do without noticing. True generosity is clear about what it is. It says, I am giving you this freely with no expectation of return because I choose to. What I was doing was something closer to, I am giving you this in silence while keeping a record of it, telling myself that someday when I am ready, I will say something. That is not generosity. That is deferred conflict wearing a generous face, and I have been honest enough with myself by now to call it that. The 41 birthday cakes were not in the same category. Those were genuinely given without expectation of anything specific in return. I made them because it was what I did, because it was my standard, because I wanted his birthday to be exactly right. That was real, and it remains real. The resentment I felt sitting at the kitchen table the evening of the birthday was not resentment of the cakes. It was resentment of the window, of what the window communicated about how the care I had put into them had been understood. It said, your effort is something I can dispose of when it is inconvenient. And that was not new information exactly. I had been receiving smaller versions of that information for a long time. The window said it plainly, in front of 4 people, without the usual softening. I am glad he came in December. I am glad the apology was real and short, and without negotiation. I do not know exactly what the relationship is now or what it will become, whether we will find a footing that is more honest and therefore more durable than what we had before, or whether certain things are simply too worn down to recover their original weight. I do not know. What I know is that I am no longer running the arrangement on terms I was too afraid to name. That is a start. At 71, I have come to understand that a start is not nothing. A start is the beginning of a thing whose outcome is not yet decided, and that is exactly what this is. The green notebook is in the drawer. I do not look at it often. It is not a trophy, and it was never a weapon. It is a record. What happened, in the order that it happened, as accurately as I could write it down at the time. That is the only thing a record is. I have made my peace with it. I had a conversation with Nadine about all of this in February, 3 months after the birthday, and a month after Dwayne and I had sat down in December. We were on my front porch, which is where we talk about real things, with our coffee and a plate of shortbread I had made that morning, because I had wanted to bake something simple. I told her I had been thinking about the question of whether I had been fair to him. Not in the sense of whether the notice had been the right response. I was clear about that and remain clear. But fair in the larger sense, over the long run. Whether the way I had run the arrangement, keeping the notebook and saying nothing, had created the very pattern I was now holding him accountable for. Nadine ate a piece of shortbread and looked out at the street. She does this. She takes the time to formulate the real answer rather than the immediate one. I have always appreciated that about her. She said, "You were fair to him in every way that cost you something. You were not fair to yourself." And she let that sit for a moment, and then she said, "Those are not the same thing." I thought about that for a while. She was right, and I had known she would be right, which is partly why I told her. There is a kind of honesty that you can only receive from someone who has been paying attention to you for 27 years and has long since stopped needing to manage your feelings about what they see. Nadine has been that person for me, and I hope I have been that for her. What she said was uncomfortable and true, and I did not argue with it. The shortbread was good. She took a second piece. We talked about other things. Her granddaughter who was applying to colleges. The new tenant at the rental house who Nadine had met once when they both happened to be on the street at the same time. She said, "Nice young couple. Paid her water bill on time even though she doesn't own the place." I said, "Yes." We understood each other. We talked about Callaways for a while, which we do not do as often as we used to. There is a version of our friendship that lives in those 11 years. The opening inventory, the early staff, the argument we had in 2004 about whether to add a savory line that we were both probably right about from our respective corners. We talked about a customer from those years, a woman named Darlene Reese, who had ordered the same French silk pie every Thanksgiving for 15 years without variation, and who sent Nadine a card when she closed her own shop that said, "Nobody else ever got the chocolate right." We sat with that for a moment. There are worse things to be said about a career. I told her I had been thinking about baking the olive oil almond cake again. She looked at me with the expression she uses when she is deciding whether to say the whole thing or the measured version. She said the whole thing. Do it. Don't let one bad afternoon be the last word on a good recipe. It's yours. I said I would when the time felt right. She said, "The time will feel right when you decide it does." Which was, when I turned it over later in the week, the most useful thing anyone said to me in all of this. Some things need waiting. Some things just need a decision. I have known that in a kitchen my whole life. I was slower to apply it to everything else. That is changing, at 71, in the direction I want it to change. We finished our coffee. The street was gray and quiet in the February way. The crepe myrtle bare on the south fence, the daffodils along the front path just starting. I had planted the bulbs in October, 2 weeks after filing the notice, without connecting the timing. I connect it now. Some things come up on their own. Most things you plant on purpose, and then you wait, and then they come up anyway. There are things I did not do after the birthday, and I want to name them, because I think they matter as much as what I did do. I did not call Dwayne back during the 2 weeks of phone calls. I want to be clear that this was not a calculated cruelty. It was not a strategy or a punishment. It was simply the truth. I did not have anything to say that the notice had not already said more clearly and more precisely than I could have said it in a conversation. A conversation would have allowed the old patterns to reassert themselves. His warmth, his way of making things lighter, my habit of accepting that lightness as resolution. The notice was not warm, it was accurate. That was what the moment required. I did not explain myself to anyone who asked. A few people asked. I mean, the extended network of acquaintances that comes from living in the same town for 29 years and running a business for 22. Someone who knew us both said something to me at the pharmacy about Dwayne looking for an apartment, framed as a question. I said, yes. That was the whole conversation. I did not feel the need to provide context. A woman who has maintained her reputation for exactness and reliability for 3 decades in a mid-sized Mississippi town does not typically owe an explanation when she exercises a legal right regarding her own property. I did not pretend to myself that it didn't cost anything. That is the most important thing I did not do. I had, for years, been telling myself that the running total in the notebook was fine, manageable, a small thing, not the point. After the birthday, I stopped telling myself that and let it be what it was. 2 years of absorbed costs, 41 years of one-directional labor, a pattern that had been real the whole time and that I had managed by looking away from it. Looking directly at it hurt. not in a dramatic way. In the quiet, accurate way that things hurt when you have finally allowed yourself to see them without the softening that habit provides. I let it hurt the appropriate amount, and I kept going. That seemed like the right response. What I did do in the months after was begin to understand something that I had been circling for years without ever quite landing on. The thing about the birthday cakes, all of them, all 41, is that they were not made for him in the way I had been telling myself. They were made from love for him, which is true, but they were also made because I needed to make them. Because I am a woman who has spent her entire life making things exactly right, and the birthday cakes were one of the primary ways I expressed that. They were as much about my standard as they were about his birthday. I needed them to be right because everything I made had to be right. That was not about him. That was about me. This is not a comfortable thing to say. It means the 41 years were not a pure gift with nothing in them for me. It means I was getting something out of those birthdays. The satisfaction of the exact thing, the particular pleasure of caring for a person. Precisely. And when the window happened, what I lost was not only the gift, but the expression of myself that the gift had carried. That is what the sidewalk actually felt like. Not just that he had rejected something I made for him, but that he had casually discarded something I made as myself with no understanding of what it cost, and with a laugh to follow. Recognizing all of this did not change the injury of the window. The injury stood on its own, regardless of my motivations. But it changed how I thought about the 41 years themselves. They were a practice I had maintained for myself that had also happened to benefit him. The window could not undo the practice. The practice was mine. No one can throw that out a window. It belonged to me from the first cake I made in the apartment kitchen on Lafayette Street, before Dwayne could even hold a fork, and it still belongs to me now on a Sunday morning in January, assembling the same recipe I had planned for 3 weeks and did not get to finish. It will always belong to me. That is not a small thing to understand. On a Sunday morning in January, 6 weeks after Dwayne and I had sat at my kitchen table in December, I got up at 5:15 the way I always do, and I stood in the kitchen for a moment in the dark before I turned on the light. I had been thinking about this Sunday for some time, not planning it exactly, not in the way I plan things for other people, with a timetable and a list, just holding it in the back of my mind as a thing I was going to do when the time was right. When I stood in the kitchen that morning, I understood that the time was right. I took the olive oil down from the shelf, the good kind, $11, the supplier I had been using since Calloway's. I had ordered a fresh bottle in October specifically. The almond flour was in the canister where it always is. I had cultured butter in the refrigerator, heavy cream, the Himalayan flake salt from the Memphis shop. I had ordered that in October too. I had been patient. I had been waiting. The batter I made slowly, the way I make things when there is no deadline. The eggs first, the sugar, then the almond flour in stages, so as not to deflate the air I had worked in. The olive oil went in after the eggs, slowly, the way you add it when you want the emulsion to hold, not poured, encouraged, the batter moving around it and accepting it, the texture changing as it came together. I watched it the way I watch batter. It behaved correctly. There is a particular satisfaction in that, in a thing behaving as it should when you have treated it correctly. I have been chasing that satisfaction for 50 years, and it has not yet stopped being worth chasing. The caramel I made once. Not because I was hurrying, but because I was not distracted, and I knew what I was doing, and the first batch was right. The color went from pale gold to the deep amber I was aiming for, and I pulled it off the blue star at the precise moment. The moment that is not instinct and not luck, but 22 years of knowing how sugar behaves when it is treated with attention. I let it cool. I worked in the cream and the butter and the salt in the order and proportion I had written down 3 weeks earlier, in the planning stage of the original cake, in the green notebook. The page was still there. I had not removed it. It was the recipe as I had developed it, the caramel that had been right the second time, and that I had not gotten to finish. Now I was finishing it. The layers I had made earlier that morning cooled on the wire rack while I worked, the smell of almond and good olive oil in the kitchen, the blue star ticking back to cool. I put the cake together with the palette knife, the one with the slight bend in the blade, taking my time because there was no other kind of time available. The caramel went into the layers the way it was supposed to. The crumb was open in the right way. When I set it on the stand and looked at it, I knew it was right. I know what right looks like. I have always known. There were no candles. I had not bought candles. The cake was not for a birthday and not for anyone. It was for a Sunday morning in my kitchen, in the early light from the east window, because I had started a thing and I wanted to finish it correctly. That is the only reason. I put the finished cake on the stand, and I cut a slice, and I set it on the blue-rimmed plate I use for my own food. The everyday plate, not the company dishes, me. I poured my coffee. I sat down at the kitchen table in the stripe of morning light that falls across the floor by 7 and moves slowly toward the range as the morning goes on. The calancho on the windowsill was doing its patient orange thing. The green notebook was in the drawer. The street outside was quiet, the way Sunday streets are quiet. A particular stillness different from every other day of the week, the ordinary sounds of the neighborhood not yet started. Mrs. Arsenault's wind chimes were still. I could hear the refrigerator. I could hear myself think. The cake was exactly right. The crumb was what I had been aiming for, and the caramel was correct, and the flake salt on top had dissolved slightly into the surface the way it does when the temperature and humidity are right, which they were. I took a second slice and finished my coffee. I did not think about the sidewalk, or the window, or the 14 phone calls, or the number 22,800. I thought about the cake, which tasted like what it was supposed to taste like. Every cake was exact. This one was no different. It was simply mine. 41 years, and the last one she made just for herself on a quiet Sunday morning. Honestly, I'd have done the same. Only sooner. If Loretta's story stayed with you, leave a comment below and subscribe. Grace's Stories is here every week.